guys?
How's it going? Thanks for having us.
Yeah, very glad to have you. So I think that block science is at the intersection of a lot of green pill stuff. A lot of the stuff that we did at Gitcoin involved block science, and let's just tee off with what is block science and what do y'all do?
I guess I'll start. So, BlockScience is an engineering design, like an analysis, sort of an R&D company. The cool thing about it is that we've grown it up pretty organically based on what money we were able to make by providing design and analysis services. And through its growth, we've focused on building it in a cooperative way. So, although it's initially formed as a C Corp structure, we're actively evolving towards a more participatory governance mechanism and even eventually legal structure changes.
And maybe just to build on that, a lot of what block science does is complex engineering, design, analysis, and so on. So a lot of Web3 enabled systems, token ecosystems are sort of complex adaptive systems that evolve over time. So while our work doesn't exclusively exist in the Web3 space, I think that's a really interesting new application for complex engineering and how we can design more robust, resilient systems over time.
The complex systems terminology is sort of proliferating and getting very popular, but it's often not something people really understand beyond a buzzword. Generally, complexity relates to things being greater than the sum of their parts, not being able to necessarily understand them from a single perspective, or by just breaking systems down into their constituent elements and understanding the elements. So one of the ways that block science has sort of developed this complex systems expertise is by drawing on a lot of different fields. So our sort of core senior engineering team includes Danilo, who's an atmospheric physicist, Jamshid, who's a computational economist, David Sisson, who did his PhD in neuroscience, but then had a whole career as a software architect. And this sort of breadth of experiences really plays into it. Actually, not to leave out Matt Barlin, who's a naval architect by formal training, who also worked on sort of CAD softwares for ship hulls and like global scale logistic systems. So like these people have these experiences that are all different, but they have certain commonalities in the way that we understand these big, hairy, sort of complex ecosystems.
Cool. So, the reason there's many reasons that I wanted to have you on the pod, but one of the primary ones is if we're going to build regenerative crypto economics, if we're going to build a more regenerative digital frontier, we're going to have to work with complex adaptive systems that evolve over time. And a problem well understood is half solved insofar as you can understand it. So let's break that down. Complex adaptive systems that evolve over time. Complexity just means it's hard to understand them, and you have to break them down into their elements, and draw on a lot of different diverse fields in order to solve them. That's complexity. Adaptive means that it evolves over time, that it adapts over time. I guess could you break down the field or sort of like the problem set of
Sure.
complex adaptive systems?
So the adapt over time is tricky because it generally means that we have multiple scales of adaptation. So there's sort of things that have let's say a highly automated, very day-to-day operation, like a protocol that says, if you do this, that happens. That's like an immediate kind of constant time scale. But then there's other time scales, like maybe there's daily cadences or monthly cadences or even year over year cadences that represent how that system changes. For example, governance versus operations. So like you have like a policy making decision in a DAO that might change the way a particular contribution is measured or rewarded, but that's different from saying, hey, we're actually fundamentally amending the kind of stuff we do or how we go about doing what we do, which is more governance oriented. And then even beyond that, you might have the emergence of new organizations or relationships between organizations, which is like where the DAO to DAO stuff comes in. And so you get these like temporal and spatial scales that are spread out over, and in particular over time here, where you don't want to muddle together things that are fast, instantaneous or day to day with things that are better understood as sort of longer term.
Incredible. Where else could we go in understanding this domain?
For the time adaptation domain, I've been putting a lot of effort into understanding like constitutional principles. Been working with a guy named Eric Alston, who's actually also there in Boulder, and exploring the way that constitutional forms create space for activities. And so, again, day-to-day activities happen within the rules or the constraints that are set by these constitutional paradigms, and that but the constitutional structures are also themselves often amendable on a much slower timescale with a lot of friction. So that research has also crossed paths with Primavera de Felipe, and is also I've done quite a bit of writing with Kelsey Navin on this subjects of sort of DAOs as these kind of again complex adaptive systems, but with an emphasis on how they change over time. I don't know, Jeff, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to point to sort of cyber physical systems in general. So cyber physical systems design is any technological and social innovate, like international power grids, for example. So power grids are always load balanced, which is tricky from an engineering perspective because you need to make sure that the amount of power being produced is roughly equivalent to the amount of power being used. But then you introduce, of course, people plugging in stuff, unplugging stuff. They're responding to different incentives in the network. Maybe those are pricing incentives where it's cheaper to use when energy is more available and more expensive to use when energy is less available. So you have all this sort of adaptive dynamic complexity in real world systems. And we just are basically using those same, control theoretic tools and, load balancing and all of that sort of graceful failure, et cetera, from real world cyber physical systems and bringing them into, the economic design layer. How can we design cyber physical commons is, one area of interest that we're researching currently.
I think what's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Zargham.
I was going to say that those cyber physical systems, these sort of public public infrastructures are essentially a kind of man-made public good. And so when we start to look at our physical infrastructures that we rely on, whether there are power grids or our transportation networks or our ISP networks, which also involve quite a lot of cables being laid and sort of maintained in order to provide you the experience of the internet, we're already looking at places where something is maybe not quite a public good insofar as you do have to pay for the ISP, the internet service. You do have some rivalrousness in the sense that there's a capacity constraint on those infrastructures. So we might need a different notion from quote public good because of the rivalrousness and the potential excludability, but nonetheless we have this concept of communal resources that we produce and maintain and all share. And so I actually think that this kind of mental model around these infrastructures is a really good one for reasoning about all sorts of other digital infrastructures that we are co-producing, with the caveat that some of these digital infrastructures have even less rivalrousness. Though, to be fair, block space is essentially the rivalrous resource of the Ethereum mainnet.
Working in Web3 is awesome. It's freeing, powerful, and so much fun. But working outside of the typical W2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many people. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work, while OPOLIS manages the back end. There's a lot of nation-state overhead when working in Web3, and OPOLIS takes care of all of the back end stuff, freeing you up to do what you do best, your work. OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. So do what you love and maintain your financial security with OPOLIS. You must be authorized to work inside the United States to receive OPOLIS's benefits, but OPOLIS is expanding its services to Canada starting on June 1st of next year. So book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS experts and join OPOLIS by December 31st to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. Goldfinch is a decentralized credit protocol with a mission to connect the world's capital to the world's growth. Goldfinch focuses on real yields from real companies, so you can stop worrying about the latest crypto Ponzi and start lending your USDC to real businesses driving growth worldwide. By lending to Goldfinch, you can drive change by expanding access to DeFi's global potential. Goldfinch's borrowers are proven fintech and credit funds in emerging markets who need access to Goldfinch's capital to drive economic growth in regions faced with barriers to financial access. In just under 2 years, Goldfinch has loaned over 100 million USDC, reaching over 1 million people and businesses across 28 countries with financing from the protocol's borrowers. Goldfinch is doing what DeFi was always meant to do, expanding financial access to those who have historically been shut out of the TradFi system. Learn how you can put your USDC to work, empowering real business growth worldwide at goldfinch.finance.
And it feels like there's so many directions we could go. One question that came to mind for me when you were talking about cipher physical systems, Jeff, was the idea of like hardness of physical constraints kind of closes the design space of complex adaptive systems that evolve over time from being so many different dimensions. And it collapses the design space by adding constraints at the front, which maybe shrinks the design space a little bit. And I'm wondering if there's an analog there with what you said, Zargham, about constitutions. Like if you add a set of rules at the foundation of the system, it constrains the design space and allows you to explore it faster. Is there a synergy between like the hardness that comes from atoms and the hardness that comes from constitutional forms?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that there is. It's not perfect, but we're creating environments where we're imposing what we often will call laws of motion on these systems. And in fact, from a methodological perspective, some of the best ways to get reliable properties is to use energy functions. So in much of our mechanism design, in order to actually get to composable mechanisms that preserve their properties, and I'm going to emphasize the composability, right? Because in Web3, we're constantly building systems that we cannot guarantee that we understand how they will be used in the future because they're constantly being composed with each other. And the physical world properties that make composability work are basically energy functions. The fact that if you have a system that preserves a particularly energy function like relationship in its laws of motion, then it doesn't matter how you use that system, what you combine with it. You can't break its internal energy rules. And so we use a lot of that analogy in order to start to both design, like establish requirements as well as verify those requirements. And as you say, sort of shrink the design space by asserting rules. But the part of the way that we make sure that those rules stand up to composition is with custom notions of energy for specific systems.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of the quadratic lands, because it really gives an idea of like a space. And really what we're doing when we design these economies is we're designing new economic spaces. And if we don't design the conservation rules properly, someone can just come in and kick it and break everything. Imagine designing a skyscraper if the force of gravity changed every 10 minutes. It wouldn't be possible. So in that sense, these constraints, making something, reducing the dimensionality is a way that we can get stability in these systems. And I think that's a really interesting sort of paradox that the constraint is actually what sets you free.
Cool. Just wanted to add for the listeners, the quadratic lands is this mythical land that was it mimetically invented at Gitcoin, but it's basically a world in which you've rewritten the laws of economics to favor the commons and to make sure that common goals and are fulfilled and there's maximum coordination. And Gitcoin's token distribution event, the actual name of the website was Quadratic Lands, where you could get your GTC token. So that's the mimetic call out that you were making with Quadratic Lands. Go ahead, Z.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the infrastructure analogies in some of our discussions here, and I think another concept that might be really helpful is differentiating between a system's properties and its implementation. So humans, like actual everyday humans interacting in spaces, care very little about the mechanisms that gave rise to the properties that they experience. I like to use analogies of, plugging your phone into the wall, you don't think much about the grid. Hopping in your car and driving, with your kids to your parents' house to visit, you don't think much about the transportation system. You log in and your computer is connected to the internet, and you really don't think much about your ISP. And there's a lot of technical depth to the production and maintenance and even coordination that gives rise to these network systems. And yet, the properties that humans care about are their relative reliability, stability, maybe fairness, a sort of, to highlight the things like the net neutrality discussion. But ultimately, these are not characteristics of the implementation. They're properties of the complex, potentially adaptive system, and that you want those properties to be reliable. So a big part of what we try to do is apply historical engineering methodologies to distinguish between the implementation and the properties, and to make the properties desirable and actually stable, reliable, even if the implementations themselves end up varying over time or need operations or governance to keep the properties upheld.
I would love to add a constraint to this conversation, and that is I'm going to do that in the form of asking a question, which is actually applying some of this. And the way I want to do that is through storytelling. In Gitcoin Grants Round 7, I came to you guys and I was like, help, we're being Sybil attacked. Quadratic funding optimizes for the number of people who fund a Gitcoin grant or a CLR fund grant or a Giveth grant, and the number of people instead of the amount they fund. And because of that, there's a crypto economic incentive to make up new identities. And that's what's called a Sybil attack problem. And so I came to BlockScience and I was like, hey, I have this complex system and I don't want the bad guys to get the matching pool money. Help. And so, tell us about the work that you designed there. Tell us what you think about Sybil resistant. And I'm adding this constraint to bring the design space into a more tangible place that hopefully people can understand through storytelling. So who wants to take a swing at it?
I'll start and then I'll pass it off to Jeff. But first thing is, Sybil attacks are obviously like common in the internet, in a world where pseudonymity is the basic notion of identity. So you can have many identities by default, and it's only in constrained spaces that you're sort of forced or bottlenecked down to have a single identity. And so it wasn't really an intrinsic issue until you combined it with a mechanism that really expects unique identity. So quadratic funding is based on a resource allocation principle that makes in its implicit assumption of unique identity. So once we had a look at the data and we found that there was this massive proliferation of what looked like bot behavior, we had to come up with a kind of classifier, a way of saying that one looks fake, that one looks real, with keeping in mind that this particular class of decision-making algorithm falls into something not unlike a court system, like a guilty, not guilty, where we don't actually know the ground truth, so our decision ends up being the thing that it gets operationalized. So the big part of what BlockScience did on the first pass was really try to examine the data and talk to people. Different projects working on Sybil resistance, like the Bright ID team, did some analysis as well. And in the course of our discussions with them, we started to scope out what it would mean to build machine learning algorithms that acted in complement with human reviewers to try to assign labels of Sybil, not Sybil, to the activity on the Gitcoin platform in order to sort of mitigate the risk of funds from the matching pool flowing to attackers disproportionately. And so we can talk more about what specifically we did, but the problem framing exercise, like to figure out, okay, Kevin called us up and said, oh shit, we've got this issue, what do we do? We have to then start by trying to understand it before we start trying to solve it.
And I think just to complexify the problem a little bit more, I think I also came to you after the Sybil resistance conversation. I was like, oh, there's also collusion attacks where people will sell their legitimate identities just to make it a little bit harder on top of the Sybil problem. Jeff, do you want to take a swing at this?
Yeah, definitely. Well, actually, I just wanted to, give some kudos and praise to the Gitcoin passport. And I think there's a really interesting because, what ended up coming out of all of this was sort of a composite of a bunch of different identity systems. And, with the, for anyone who doesn't know how that worked, it was, essentially you could attest or prove your identity on Bright ID, IDENA network. There are a number of different identity networks, and you could get essentially a bonus multiplier on your donations based on how many platforms you were verified on. And I think this is a really interesting way that we can compose different Web3 primitives, because each of those identity networks probably, thought they were solving the problem all on their own. But what you find oftentimes is that they're sort of solving for one perspective on that, or one ecosystem. So I really like the Gitcoin product that ended up coming out of this is sort of a enmeshment of a bunch of different identity networks to create an even stronger Sybil identity or Sybil prevention mechanism, and then turn that around and offer that as a product to the larger Web3 ecosystem. I think that speaks beautifully of the composability and the power of these protocols and algorithms.
I would say that identity is one of the hardest places to deal with composition, right? Because just think about some specific cases. I could use Bright ID on one hand and like Twitter and GitHub and a few other things on another hand to create two distinct identities that are each partially supported by by tools being used for identity. And in the process, you could get some degree of sibling, though I'll grant you it's bounded because you're limited by sort of the number of platforms that are respected within the system. But the thing about the passport that I think is important for people to understand is that there's a very big difference between a passport and, say, stamps in your passport or attestations within your passport. And so you're not actually alleviating the need for sort of trustworthy, and I'll call them institutions, even if those institutions are themselves, DAOs or, algorithms maintained by groups of people. Again, I'm going to use Bright ID as my favorite example. Sort of Bright ID is a thing that you could come to trust as Bright ID. And insofar as you trust it, then it would be meaningful for you to see that in your Gitcoin passport. And the same for any other attestation mechanism that has been integrated or composed into the passport system. So in a way, creating a nice standardized API, so to speak, a place or data structure that you could go to look for those attestations and know how to read them, have a reasonable expectation about how to interpret them, is actually really critical as a sort of data source for people who are building any sort of protocol that requires a stronger notion of identity, but your particular decision about how that data will be used in your app is still in your own policy space as the dApp developer that's using something like the Gitcoin passport. I hope that's helpful for clarification, because I think often we can get muddled up between the difference between the technical mechanisms and the social mechanisms that are used to underpin identity in digital spaces.
One area where I'd love to go is that, while Sybil resistance is an important money Lego for the ecosystem, and one human, one vote DAOs are better in some ways than more plutocratic DAOs, maybe one human, one vote DAOs aren't the ultimate final destination of what happens once we have Sybil resistance. I'm wondering, Jeff, what you think of that?
Yeah, definitely. And I see this a lot in the Web3 ecosystem that, there's a spectrum, definitely, from, one human, one vote on one side and one token, one vote on the other. And there's all sorts of sort of interesting space in the middle. And I think quadratic voting strikes an interesting balance between those poles. But I mean, it's a bit of a contrary opinion, but I don't think one person, one vote is the epitome of democracy that we treat it like in the world today. And actually, I don't think there are many many decisions that are, society faces where everyone should have the same decision-making power. And I don't mean we should disenfranchise anybody, absolutely not. But the interesting thing with tokens is, well, one, we move away from this binary yes, no. When we vote in representative democracy systems, essentially we put a 1 and a couple of zeros into the system. Our societal signal processing system, we do that once every 4 years. My Nintendo has better signal throughput than that. So in terms of, and also intensity of preference, we can only say we want this, we don't want this. We can't say how much. or how much we want it or how much we don't want it. So we lose a lot of, in terms of signal processing, you have a much richer space of decision making, of collective sentiment aggregation, when you give people the ability to say, I'm partly for this, I'm wholly for this, I'm wholly against this. It's a much richer signal space, and it could allow for far more sort of collective intelligence processing over just yes, no decision making.
Yeah, the governance design space is something that DAOs are really opening up, but we're still very focused on the procedures also. So much of what you're describing can also take place in, say, deliberative processes and or less formal constructions. So we're seeing an unbundling of governance mechanisms and then giving people sort of, our communities, sort of a la carte primitives to combine together to create their own collective intelligence. And for better or worse, I think some things work together well and other things clash a little bit. So the interesting thing that's going on right now is you see organizations configuring differently and then discovering how things work and then adjusting their internal decision making rules according to what they learned from trying to apply them. And Jeff, I think one of the things that I like the most about your point about one person, one vote is the comments about only being able to say yes or no. I think that there's so much room for both expressing intensity of preference and also just expressing new things that aren't easily put on a docket. So having more openness about how things get onto the list of things to be considered by the group, how they get curated down to the things that are actively being considered, because in much of our existing political process, those processes are very hard to get involved in a meaningful way. And as a result, most people only ever experience a choice that they want neither of. And getting to a place where people are more enthusiastic about at least some of the choices put in front of them is a really good goal, and that we can start by making this the case in our DAOs.
Yeah, I think there's really a much larger space for participatory democracy using these kinds of emergent or bottom-up signaling systems that are enabled by tokens that we just don't really like. It's not really in our collective imagination because we're used to representative democracy. And I forget what I was reading recently, but basically that this is not democracy at all, because we have almost no decision right before the vote, even after the vote. Maybe I voted for a politician who promised electoral reform and then didn't deliver it 3 months later, and now I'm stuck with them for 4 years. Even though they didn't do what they said they would do. So I think it's a really interesting new mechanisms to enable more adaptiveness and responsiveness in terms of our political systems and how we make decisions collectively.
Democracy in the context of complex adaptive systems is more about having meaningful feedback loops between the governed and the process that governs them. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that we start putting the procedures or the rules in the role of, hey, as long as we follow this democratic process, we're democratic. And if the lived experience of the participants is not one of having, again, a meaningful feedback loop upon the system that governs them, then I would be hard pressed to call that democracy. The interesting thing is the separation between the property and the lived experience of the constituent versus the definition or the declaration of the mechanism. And although crypto gives us a lot of mechanistic design space, it's ultimately not about the mechanisms themselves. It's about using them to create sort of a member experience that is truly enfranchising.
It reminds me a little bit of this famous quote about political philosophy, that the consent of the governed is the only basis for legitimacy of the actions of governments. So as opposed to like the divine right of king, where your moral right to rule comes from above, comes from God, the consent of the governed kind of creates that closed loop where you can hopefully, if you're doing it well, create procedures and rules that create a container in which the lived experience of having that feedback from the people you're governing actually happens. So
There are two
it just
halves of
connects
that.
to political
Yes,
philosophy
actually,
for me.
that piece of political philosophy is super relevant, but I would go so far as to say it's about half of the equation. You need the consent of the governed insofar as people feel that they're meaningfully being heard and that they have again, that they're enfranchised in these processes. But anyone who's tried to design something by committee also knows that, a consensus decision doesn't lead to a good outcome necessarily. And so the tension is between the legitimacy from the perspective of fulfilling purpose. So say we all agree on the purpose of this collective, this organization, and we see the outcome individually, and we form our own opinions about whether it is succeeding relative to our interpretation of the purpose of that system. That is the thing that's sometimes in tension with the individual capacity to influence the direction it's moving. So the kinds of collective intelligence and democratic processes that we are striving for in these regenerative economies are ones that are capable of holding the tension between individual participation and capacity to influence the direction of the system with the potentially individual and sort of group level assessment of whether the system is actually fulfilling its intended purpose or succeeding in its goal of care, maintenance, regeneration, etc. And again, a lot of emphasis on the fact that there isn't going to be one absolute right answer, in part because we have to hold this tension between the community of contributors and or parties affected by the decisions and the process of making and evaluating decisions from the perspective of some potentially concrete and in other cases somewhat nebulous goals. I mean, if I asked what it would mean to regenerate the planet, we'd be hard pressed to put a single number on it. But on the other hand, we could come up with whole batteries of metrics which we feel strongly are individually correlated with what we mean by regeneration.
And I think that's some of the beauty of these tools as well, is that we don't have to compress everything into one metric, which is part of the problem today, where we try to compress everything into dollars. What is the ultimate baseline cost, or what is the bottom line? And when we flatten all of that, we miss a lot of the equation, we miss or we purposefully leave out, and these are externalities. And when we try to flatten something too much, we lose out on the rich additional dimensions. And I think there's a lot of space to play in these higher dimensions, but we just kind of miss that when we try to collapse it all into this one economic substrate of the dollar economy. So I think having tokens to represent multiple different forms of value, simplistically, carbon credits, to monitor carbon accounting. This is one of the, big directions the Web3 space has gone, likely because there's already this sort of institutional design space around carbon credits existing in the real world. But we could do that for any number of metrics, ecological, social, and there could be just a much larger proliferation of understanding the value in various different dimensions without having to lose that richness by collapsing to something too flat.
I mean, it feels like pluralism is maybe something that bakes into the base layer here, where you're not going to just have one economic system. You're going to have a plurality of economic system that supports different levels of infrastructure. The US dollar, which is, what commodities will be traded in. Ethereum, which is the index of the Web3 ecosystem. And then the DApps and DAOs that all represent their own little sub-local economies. And that's the Web3 version of this, but you can almost imagine there being localities, like physical localities with their own value systems also. So I don't know, is pluralism something at the base layer, you think, of these things?
I view it as pretty fundamental as a concept. I've been the way that this manifests in practice for me is biodiversity of political economic forms. And so it doesn't necessarily mean just everything's great, in the sense that every design is good, but it means that there are many different species that are all individually viable and capable of entering into symbiotic or ecosystemic relationships with each other. So yeah, in a way you could interpret that as saying that a monoculture or a monopolitical economy is actually less robust, less healthy, and less regenerative than one that is fundamentally pluralistic, because it's the pluralism concept that sort of encodes this idea that a healthy economy or a healthy political economy is one with a high degree of institutional biodiversity.
COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses that need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage its treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the highly secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasury management to expressive, flexible, and multi-chain treasury features, such as global user management, global contacts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Masari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. You have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless. The world has woken up to refi, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer 1 for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed to producing a sustainable future from day one and has built its technology around one of the lowest carbon impact consensus mechanisms, and is the world's first carbon negative EVM compatible layer 1 blockchain. CELO is a movement to create the conditions of prosperity for everyone, whether it's tokenizing carbon credits with Toucan, providing capital to underserved communities with Unicorn, or building for millions of users around the globe. CELO was created to transform crypto enthusiasts into a movement of change makers. Follow along on Twitter at CELO.org to learn more about how CELO is accelerating refi for a positive, lasting impact on people, communities, and the planet. And if you're a builder interested in refi, be sure to join the Build with CELO hackathon live now with a prize pool of over $100,000.
So let me try to connect some dots here, and I'd love to get your reaction. Gitcoin, well, GreenPill is all about creating more regenerative digital frontier. At Gitcoin, we memed this idea of the quadratic lands into the ether, pun intended. And the idea was a world in which we've rewritten the laws of economic gravity to support the commons and to support collective resource allocation. And the way that you do that is with mechanism design that harnesses collective intelligence that is legitimate because it has a feedback loop of the people that it's governed, and also is more effective at allocating resources because it's collective intelligence. But there's not going to be one collective intelligence. We're going to have a pluralism, biodiversity of political economic forms that is going to make up the gestalt of maybe the vessel to the quadratic lands, just to land back where I started, which is, building more regenerative digital frontier. I mean, is the quadratic lands, it sounds like it doesn't just have one infrastructure or vessel to get there. It's got many vessels, and it's the plurality of them is how we make sure that we make it there.
Yeah, I would say that I view the quadratic lands as we've articulated it as a much higher dimensional space. So to kind of imagine that the economics that we live in today as a kind of flat land, then the quadratic lands is higher dimensional. And in that higher dimensional space, there are lots of different kinds of value, some which might not be commoditizable. So things that are not transferable or sort of locally defined at an individual level or a relationship level or at an entity level. But even going beyond that, I think it's important to remember that collective intelligence isn't a magic wand. You don't just feed a bunch of information into a pot, stir it around, and it spits out good decisions. In practice, the biological forms of collective intelligence have very specific sort of protocols or laws of motion or information systems underpinning them. And that when we if you were to hijack or manipulate those just a little bit, the coordination breaks down. So if there's one thing that I would want people to take away from this conversation, it's that it's not just about sort of coordination at the level of, hey, we coordinated, so it's going to work great. It's actually about the specific coordination mechanisms and their fitness to the specific problem at hand. And the plurality comes in because there's a whole lot of different problems happening concurrently. And so you need to be able to find solutions that make sense in context and that they're capable of sharing some space. So they need to both work locally and they need to work in composition with the other things that work locally. And actually doing that, A, absolutely requires pluralism. B, it requires a much higher dimensional notion of what value can mean and a focus on coherence over consistency. Consistency here meaning things match up exactly and you can point to them and say, oh, yes, that means this means that. Whereas coherence relaxes that and says, okay, the words, the mechanisms, the expectations in this regime and that regime could be different, but when they encounter each other in the real world, they cohere enough, they hang together. And again, biology, nature actually has this, like the models or mechanisms that we use to describe the phenomena in nature are very distinct based on what you're modeling, but they hang together, they cohere, even when they don't agree.
Jeff, anything to add?
I was just taking notes on that because that I think is a really great. It's all about the joints between these systems. We can, when we design joints, you can design tightly coupled joints, you can design loosely coupled joints, and I think these tools are really interesting because we can, in new ways, blend things that couldn't be blended before. Like tokens can be seen as currency, or what we say as money. Tokens can be seen as equity. Tokens can be seen as voice. Tokens can be seen as all sorts of interesting things, all in one vehicle. So I think there's really interesting new ways that we can design these joints, and how loosely coupled or tightly coupled, depending on their context, and to allow these new systems to interoperate, but also, like fractalize up, sideways, down. And I think there's sort of infinite diversity, so interesting to consider.
One of the things that's really exciting for me about this is this idea of cooperation across social distance, in a system that coheres well. So, if you contrast, especially when you think about the current generation of social media in which we're all creating these echo chambers, where we've got these filter bubbles and we're all kind of like doubling down within these holons, these holes that are smaller. How do we create cooperation across social distance? And the example of me being in Boulder and someone else being in Denver, if we both agree on the same public good, maybe that's a signal to the state that that's a good public good. Or to use non-spatial analogy on Gitcoin grants, if someone who mostly funds ETH2 projects and someone who mostly funds climate projects agree on a third project, then that social distance means that there's probably a lot of intelligence there. And so I don't know, Zargham, when you were talking about using keeping cohesiveness of the multiple layers of the system so that they act together and they don't revolt against each other, that's kind of where my mind went. And maybe tokens can be used to do this, to Jeff's point. Does that bring anything up for either of you?
Yeah, actually, I mean, there's a concept that I really like, called subsidiarity, which I believe originally stems from the Catholic Church's doctrine, but it relates
Right.
to pushing decision-making authority down to the lowest level it can go to, but no lower, and kind of distributes load in scale. And so there are some things that are very local. Like maybe I'm in a little working group with 3 people in a sub DAO of a DAO, and we're making decisions about something very operational in the context of that work, and we've had that authority delegated to us. But on the other hand, there's going to be some decision making that might be, in that sub DAO or in that DAO, or as I'm moving up, then some things are like say it's on mainnet, so the Ethereum protocol itself dictates a set of constraints on what we can do, and then there's higher level things that might relate to, let's just say, what we consider to be appropriate behavior, period. Things that are maybe morally or ethically appropriate, even if they're, not even if they're within the scope of things you're able to do within any one of those rule systems. And sorry, that was a little bit rambly, but the idea here is that there's decision making that lives at every one of those scales concurrently, and that what some of this coherence comes from is sort of the really high level, maybe principles that help us determine what our values are, what kinds of activities are morally or ethically appropriate, and that allows for coherence. And if we go down one level, we might get something like a networking protocol, and if we go down another level, we might get something that's like more contextual and thus further defined. And the further you go down, the more defined you get. To your point about information, though, I think it is very interesting when things that are distant in that graph end up having similarities, and then sort of exposing those similarities or reasoning about what information lives in the edges, when something that was otherwise uncoupled turns out to be aligned, correlated, or otherwise same. That might actually lead to a restructuring in the future. It might creation of a new unit at some mid scale that allows us to leverage that alignment.
I think I keep looking to biomimetic processes when it comes to a lot of these things, and particularly like mycelial networks. I think are a really great example. One of the most sustainable network economies in nature. If you haven't seen the film Fantastic Fungi, definitely recommend checking it out. But basically, they're a distributed network that problem solves at the edges. They're incredible resource allocators. They move things from one part of the network to another. They interact with various organisms like trees. Anything underground is connected via mycelial networks, which is transmitting information from parent trees to child trees, or all over the forest, sort of thing. So I think there's a lot that we can study and understand about the way that they sense make, and they're also similar to neurons in the brain. There are just all sorts of examples of these kinds of distributed decision-making networks in nature that I think we can learn from, and find those principles of sustainability that we can bring into our human economic systems, such that they can act more sustainably and in alignment with their environment, like we see in nature.
So I would like to add something that maybe is meta commentary. I really, really appreciate Jeff, because I live in this world where I'm constantly trying to figure out all of this really complex engineering and social system stuff with legal scholars and economic scholars and engineering scholars. And it can be really easy to get wrapped up in sort of big words and complex concepts, and then try to design things that benefit from that knowledge. But at the end of the day, it's not realistic to try to sort of operate in that level of jargon all of the time. And although I tend to live in that universe, I work pretty closely with Jeff, and he does an amazing job making the concepts that the BlockScience team either develops or learns about or collaborates with people on widely accessible. And I actually think that's also an important primitive of good governance, is to have legibility and sort of public engagement, even when some of the mechanisms or the design of those mechanisms requires pretty intensive sort of research and design work to find the thing which will hopefully itself be simple, even if it was a long path to get there. So hard-fought simplicity as a goal, and people in your team and who are really good at taking the complex and making it accessible is really, really valuable. So anyway, huge props to Jeff. So I'll stop talking now.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this episode will be more legible to the average listener because of you, Jeff. Well, I think that we've spent about 43 minutes diverging, and now it is time to converge, as we only have 5 minutes left. So I'll ask you one broad closing question and then one very constrained closing question. Let's start with: is there anything that I didn't ask that you wanna talk about before we wrap?
I think that one of the most interesting things for me, and Web3 gets a lot of flack. There's a lot of people thinking that Web3 is here to economize democracy, but I think actually Web3 is here to democratize economy. And I think there are only a few sort of large institutions capable of enforcing real change on this planet, and it's governments, corporations, large scale institutions, but most of those are actually not democratic at all, in terms of realistically taking inputs from citizens or stakeholders, especially those who are impacted, more so those who are impacted than those who are not, I would say. So to the critics of Web3 out there saying, hey, you're just trying to make governance for sale, I would say, actually, I think we're just trying to make economies, which are probably the most fundamental coordination mechanism of humanity on a large scale, more accountable to the people and the environment that they exist in. That includes nature, the planet, ecologies, societies, and so on.
Zargham, you're up. Can you top that?
No, I definitely can't top that. I will say that relatedly, for me, this is very much about understanding algorithms as policies, and it does tie into what Jeff's saying in that if we want to actually govern economies, that we need to recognize that things like monetary policies and or measurements of contributions or rewards or penalties, etc., are all algorithms that get developed by communities for the goals of those communities, and that respecting that those things are policymaking acts and enfranchising people in that policymaking is a big part of how we could actually produce this institutional biodiversity, this pluralism, this effective pluralism. And obviously, to Jeff's point, the big win then is if we can successfully democratize our economies.
That's a great place to end it. Where can people find BlockScience and you both online?
The BlockScience Twitter is at @block_science. I'm at Jeff Emmett, and I believe, Z, you are at Zargham.
That is correct.
Great. We'll have those links in the show notes for easy clicking. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This was a really fun episode.
Thanks for having us. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks again for having us. And yeah, Jeff, you definitely, I think you nailed it with that last one.
Yeah, it's our moment of zen. Nice. Which I took a note here. A lot of people think that Web3 is here to economize democracy. What they don't see is Web3 is here to democratize economies. I think that's really cool, the symmetry in that. That's where we'll end. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.
I got to show you one more thing. Those look familiar?
Oh, wow. It's like a board meeting.
Well, no, my ETHbot and my Moloch are right there at the other end of the table.
Okay.
Down at the far end.
Nice. So I've actually got, for people who are watching on video, what we're looking at is, if you look at my video, I've got an ETHbot and a Moloch, which was an NFT campaign that the Gitcoin DAO did. And Zargham just showed us that he has physical statues of the ETHbot Moloch NFTs. So that was a fun campaign and a fun little memory that we have together. Cool. All right. Cheers. Bye, guys.
See ya.
Great chatting.